Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back a few centuries. So go ahead, dim the lights. Settle into whatever sleeping position currently feels like a negotiation with your spine. And let your brain slide into that pleasant, maybe I will fall asleep to obscure history again mode. Because tonight we're wading into the warm, fragrant steam of Ottoman coffeehouses. Not the modern, overpriced versions where someone named Murat confidently serves you a latte that tastes like hot regret. No, we're talking about the original, quietly chaotic social hubs of the empire, places where ideas brewed as thick as the coffee itself. So let's just float in, slowly, gently, like a coffee bean drifting its way into historical significance. Let's picture this. It's sometime in the early 1500s. The Ottoman Empire is comfortably swelling into one of the most powerful states on the planet. And people, being people, are looking for new ways to avoid doing their actual work. And yes, I'm happy to report they succeed gloriously. Enter the first wave of coffeehouses, known as cafés, which start popping up in cities like Istanbul. And right away, these places become wildly popular because, honestly, what's not to love? A warm drink, a mildly gossipy atmosphere, and absolutely no productivity happening inside. The Ottomans had discovered a drink that kept them awake, mildly alert, and perfectly primed for lengthy conversations about politics they had no intention of participating in. A timeless tradition. The coffee itself was strong, dark, thick enough that if you dropped a spoon inside, it would probably lodge itself into a deep philosophical crisis. It wasn't meant to be gulped down. You just sipped it slowly, while contemplating your life choices or the latest palace rumor. And yes, even in the 1500s, there were rumors. Humans are consistent like that. Now, the thing about Ottoman coffeehouses is that they weren't just places to drink a beverage. They were everything. A news hub, a social club, a complaint about your job center, a theater, a study hall, a makeshift political forum, and occasionally an unofficial gambling den filled with grown men deeply invested in whether a piece on a backgammon board would move left or right. If you walked into one of these early coffee houses, you'd notice something right away. Everyone is seated very close together because chairs were apparently not a priority. People often sat on low stools or cushions, leaning in over small wooden tables like way from historical collapse. The air was thick with tobacco smoke, because, of course, someone invented smoking, and immediately everyone said yes. That seems like a perfectly great idea. Pipes were everywhere. The long-stemmed Ottoman pipe, the narjo or hookah, and smaller personal pipes filled the room with a fog dense enough to hide your social anxiety. And in classic bedtime history fashion, nothing exciting happened. Just men sitting around, sipping something bitter, inhaling smoke, and pretending they understood politics. If you visited one in Istanbul, you'd probably see groups forming naturally. Some tables hosted merchants debating grain prices like it was the world's least engaging sport. Others might host scholars quietly discussing legal opinions from the latest religious debates. And then, of course, you had the storytellers, because every society needs that one guy who sits in public and confidently narrates things no one asked for. These storytellers were called mita, solo performers who told dramatic tales using nothing but their voice, their eyebrows, and maybe a wooden stick they pretended was a sword, a cane, or someone's annoying mother-in-law. Think of them as the original one-man podcasts, except you couldn't skip the ads. The mito would perform legendary epics, folktales, or exaggerated retellings of things that definitely did not happen the way they claimed. Listeners, meanwhile, nodded along like, yes, of course, a giant serpent lived in the Bosporus. That sounds totally reasonable. And through all of this, coffee houses became known as places where dangerous ideas were exchanged. By dangerous ideas, I mean someone expressing a lukewarm complaint about taxes, or implying that maybe, possibly, the Sultan's new policy wasn't the best idea ever created by a human being. Scandalous. Government officials were not thrilled. Because nothing terrifies an empire more than civilians casually chatting while caffeinated. Let's drift a bit deeper inside. Imagine that you're sitting in one of these coffee houses, a clay cup of coffee warming your hands, and you re-listening to a man passionately explain why his cousin's donkey is the real hero of his village. The room murmurs around you. Someone is playing a slow tune on a saz, a long-necked string instrument whose entire job is to gently lull your brain into a near-sleep state. The walls might be decorated with simple wooden shelves holding cups, pipes, and the occasional decorative item stolen sari, borrowed from someone's home. Everything has this slightly lived-in, slightly shabby atmosphere. Ottoman chic. The coffee maker, or kafeci, stands behind a small counter, tending the large brass pots of simmering coffee. Making coffee was an art, slow, deliberate, and lightly judgmental. If you ordered something too sweet, he prejudged you with the same intensity a modern barista gives someone ordering whipped cream with a side of latte. Guests weren't rushed. No one was tapping their foot waiting for a table to clear. You could sit there for hours, days, even if you were particularly dedicated to ignoring your responsibilities. And this slow rhythm became part of the cultural fabric. Coffee houses weren't about the drink. They were about existing in a shared space, gently and lazily, while doing as little as humanly possible. Ironic plot twist: the Ottomans banned coffee multiple times because of this exact people being too socially active problem. Coffee houses were considered places of corruption, idleness, and rebellious conversation. Which, to be fair, isn't completely wrong. But let's float over to something slightly more amusing: the dress code. Now, officially, there wasn't one. But unofficially, oh yes, there were expectations. Young men tried to look fashionable, which usually meant a big turban, a robe with more folds than necessary, and shoes that curled up at the toe, like they were attempting to escape their own fashion choices. The art of sitting still for long periods of time, a valuable skill in a coffee house, actually. Scholars often brought books which stayed open but rarely read, mostly using them as props to look intellectual. Again, a timeless human behavior. Now, I'd love to say that Ottoman coffee houses were peaceful havens of intellectual harmony. But no, of course not. They were also centers of petty arguments, stupid debates, and the occasional "you cheated" at backgammon complaint. Some things never change. Backgammon Tavaler was the unofficial national sport of the coffee house. You'd hear the click-clack of dice and wooden pieces almost constantly. It was the soundtrack of the place, slow, rhythmic, soothing, until someone got overly competitive. The game was so popular that some men became known for their tavola personalities, which ranged from calm strategists to people who treated each loss like a personal betrayal by fate. But even the arguments stayed within the sleepy, relaxed energy of the coffee house. No brawls, no shouting matches, just mild irritation delivered in polite tones because everyone was too caffeinated to escalate anything. As night fell, the atmosphere changed but remained calm. Coffee houses stayed open late, especially in big cities. Lanterns were lit. The air grew quieter, and the conversations deepened into that philosophical, late-night zone where every man suddenly considered himself a poet. This was when things slowed to their gentlest pace. A nap in a corner wasn't unusual. People drifting off mid-conversation, completely normal. Ideal, even. Ottoman nights were cool. The streets outside were dim. The call to prayer echoed softly across the rooftops. And inside the coffeehouse, everything felt suspended in warm stillness. If you fell asleep in a corner, the owner might just let you be. It was that kind of place. And so, as we leave the warm glow of the Kavahane behind, let's carry that sense of slow, shared stillness with us. Let the murmurs of history fade into a gentle hum. Let your own thoughts drift away, just like the smoke from an old Ottoman pipe. Sleep well. All right, welcome back. Let's sink a little deeper into that warm, caffeinated haze of the Ottoman world. If you're still awake, grats. If you're drifting, also congrats. That's kind of the whole point. So, let's wander back inside the coffeehouse. Same drifting smoke, same slow clatter of backgammon pieces, same men pretending they understand politics more than the Grand Vizier himself. We're still in the 1500s and 1600s, and the Ottoman coffeehouse is basically the original third place, not home, not work. Just somewhere to vibe, complain, and sip something bitter enough to dissolve a horseshoe. Now, to understand the Ottoman coffeehouse, you have to understand the drink holding it all together. Ottoman coffee was prepared in a small pot called a sez, usually made of copper or brass. Imagine a tiny pot with a long handle, specifically designed so the coffee maker didn't accidentally boil their fingers off. The coffee grounds were incredibly fine, like powdered earthand mixed with water and sugar, depending on your taste. Then it was heated slowly over charcoal. And I mean slowly, painfully slowly. Slow enough that the coffee maker had plenty of time to judge every customer who dared to rush them. The OG, please stop looking at your watch. It'll be ready when it's ready energy. And when the coffee was served, it wasn't filtered. The grounds settled at the bottom like a gritty little swamp you politely ignored. You drank the top portion, savoring the rich, almost syrupy liquid, and left the thick sludge behind. This person was often a young boy or a teenager, and he would walk around offering cups of cold water between sips. The idea was simple. Coffee dries your mouth out like the Sahara, and water keeps you refreshed enough to stay there for another 3 hours, discussing why the price of bread is too high. Sometimes the water boy also delivered messages, ran errands, or acted as the unofficial emotional support child of the room. Someone loses a game of backgammon. The water boy shows up. Someone tells a depressing story. The water boy shows up. Someone lets out a loud, dramatic sigh. The water boy, ready with hydration and moral support. Of course, we have to talk about the janissaries in coffeehouses because, well, of course, they show up. The janissaries were the elite military corps of the empire, famous, feared, and occasionally a walking HR nightmare. Picture the most overconfident group in your workplace. Multiply it by 10 and put them in matching uniforms. They loved coffeehouses. Loved them. Partly because they needed a place to gather, gossip, and maintain a sense of group identity. Partly because they enjoyed intimidating people with their presence. Backgammon games grew more competitive, and a storyteller tried not to accidentally imitate any military officers unless they wanted to disappear forever. They brought loud opinions. Speaking of storytellers, let's relax into their world for a moment. The Mida was a full-on performer, but with a subtle, sleepy charm. He often carried just 2 props, a cane and a handkerchief. With these, he'd switch characters, shift voices, and weave entire stories. The moral usually boiled down to something simple, like don't be greedy or don't marry someone who hates your cooking. But don't imagine loud performances. No one was headbanging in the Ottoman Coffeehouse. It was soft, gentle music, rhythms that swayed like quiet breathing. But of all the characters inside a coffee house, my absolute favorite is the gossip master. This wasn't an official role. It was just that one guy, usually over 50, wearing a turban too large for his head, who somehow knew everything happening in the city. Where did he get this information? Who knows? Maybe he had spies. Maybe he made it all up. Maybe he had supernatural gossip powers. But if you wanted to know why the baker on the next street suddenly raised his prices, this man had an answer ready. If you wanted to know whether the vizier was planning a new tax, he had sources. He was basically a walking, barely reliable newsfeed. People gathered around him, not because he was always correct, but because he was always interesting. And in a coffee house, that's honestly more important. Of course, the government eventually said, people are meeting in large groups, talking, laughing, sharing thoughts, sitting comfortably. We must stop this. So, between the 1500s and 1600s, Ottoman rulers banned coffeehouses several times. Sometimes they even banned coffee itself, which is the historical equivalent of banning happiness. The official reasons varied. Coffeehouses encouraged idleness. They fostered political discussion. They attracted gamblers. People stayed up too late. Unofficially, the authorities didn't love hundreds of citizens gathering, caffeinated, and discussing whether the government had lost its touch. But each time they shut the coffee houses down, the people simply combed them quietly, secretly, or sometimes not secretly at all. It turns out you can't ban vibes. Let's slow down and float through the daily rhythms of one of these places. A typical day in a coffee house began early, sometimes opening soon after dawn prayer. Men who worked in markets or workshops would grab a cup before starting their day. The morning coffee houses were quiet, like a peaceful startup screen for the city. Just soft conversation, light clinking, and maybe a sleepy argument about whether it would rain. Then came the midday rush. Merchants took breaks. Students came with books, pretending to study, while mostly watching people walk past. Travelers arrived, bringing news from other towns. It was the social heartbeat of the neighborhood. Afternoons were for games, mostly backgammon and chess. Chess was considered distinguished and intellectual. Backgammon was considered loud, competitive, and a little annoying. Naturally, backgammon was way more popular. As evening approached, the atmosphere mellowed again. The older regulars arrived. Musicians played their soft tunes. The coffee simmered even more slowly. The night ended when the last oil lamp was extinguished and the final guest reluctantly stood up, stretching his legs after pretending the stool was comfortable for hours. The Ottoman Coffeehouse wasn't just a building. It was a rhythm, a habit, a place where time stretched and softened. To the Ottomans, it became a little world of its own, a sanctuary built on bitter coffee and shared moments of doing absolutely nothing. And really, isn't that something we could all use a little more of? Thanks for watching. Even better. Tonight, we keep drifting through the slow, smoky, delightfully unhurried world of Ottoman coffeehouses. And this time, we're going deeper to the weird, the specialized, and the why was this even a thing? Corners of the culture. Think proto-intellectual hipsters. Lots of book reading, lots of quiet sighing, lots of emotionally charged poetry recited at volumes entirely unnecessary for the room. Someone would read a verse about the heartbreak of unrequited love, and half the room would nod like yes. My soul feels that. Meanwhile, the coffee maker in the corner would whisper, he's single for a reason. Now, let's float a bit further into the subtle social rules of these places. Rules that weren't written down, but everyone knew them. Well, almost everyone. Rule number 1: don't rush the coffee maker. Ever. If your cup is late, congratulations, you're experiencing Ottoman tradition. Coffee was made slowly, deliberately. Complaining about the wait only guaranteed you more waiting. The coffee maker had the aura of a tolerant but exhausted uncle. He didn't argue. He simply took even longer. Rule number 2: don't interrupt a storyteller. Unless you wanted the media to roast you in front of the entire room. And oh, they would. Imagine being heckled by a man with a cane and perfect comedic timing. Brutal. Rule 3: don't slam dice too loudly. Backgammon was competitive, but excessive enthusiasm was frowned upon. A gentle tap was fine. A loud slam was a social crime, especially if it scared the old man next to you, who was deep in thought, probably meditating on whether his goat liked him. Rule number 4: sip, don't gulp. Ottoman coffee wasn't meant to be chugged. The drink was too thick anyway. If you swallowed the grounds by accident, you'd spend 10 minutes coughing like you were trying to expel the concept of coffee itself. Drinking slowly was refined, elegant, sleepy, perfect for bedtime history, actually. And rule number 5: avoid sensitive political topics, or at least pretend to. Political talk was common, inevitable even, but everyone kept it gentle, soft, veiled with metaphors. Something like, I hear the trees in the palace garden are shaking these days. Translation: the government is doing something stupid, but we'd all like to keep our heads today. Now, here's something charming. Everyone had their seat, maybe a cushion under the window, a stool near the door, a corner table close to the musicians. Seats were not officially assigned, but unofficially, absolutely assigned. If someone sat in your spot, you didn't argue. You just stood there, silently, with a disappointed expression so strong it could melt stone. Eventually, the intruder moved. This was known as Ottoman passive aggression, and it worked beautifully. Let's drift now into the small rituals. Because coffeehouses were built on rituals, tiny habits, little social dances that made the whole experience feel special. The tiny cups, handleless and fragile, were always placed on a saucer. The saucer often had a geometric design that looked like something from a meditation app. People turned the cup slowly after finishing, not for fortune-telling, that was more common in homes, but out of habit. Turn the cup, let it cool. Gently place it down. Repeat. It was calming, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. A small, personal moment of peace. Then there was the pipe ritual. The long Ottoman pipe, the kubak, required care. Men cleaned the bowl, packed the tobacco, lit it gently, inhaled slowly, exhaled dramatically. It gave them an air of mysterious wisdom, even if they had none. And the smell was everywhere, sweet, woody, smoky. A scent that lingered long after you left, clinging to your clothes like a memory. And the greeting ritual. It was so simple, so effective. You entered. You nodded. Everyone nodded back. No words needed. Just a room full of men quietly acknowledging each other like they were members of a very relaxed, secret society. This simple gesture created an immediate sense of belonging and calm. But the one thing that really shaped daily life was this: coffeehouses were escapism. For the poor, it was a warm place to rest aching muscles. For merchants, a place to forget deadlines. For scholars, a place to pretend they understood complex philosophy. For janissaries, a place to avoid training. For storytellers, a place to be adored by an audience of half-asleep listeners. And for everyone else, it was a pocket of calm in a loud and unpredictable world. The empire could be chaotic. Taxes fluctuated. Wars erupted. Officials annoyed everyone. Life was exhausting. But inside a coffeehouse, everything slowed down, softened, settled. Time didn't matter. Politics didn't matter. Responsibilities didn't matter. Just the coffee, the company, and the warm, grounding ritual of simply being there together. That was the magic. A quiet refuge for a few precious hours. I hope you enjoyed this deeper dive. Let the comforting quiet of these coffee houses carry you into a peaceful rest. Welcome back, or welcome forward, or welcome sideways. Time gets a little fuzzy when we're floating through these centuries-old caffeine clouds. If you're drifting off, that's even better. Either way, let's gently slide into another layer of Ottoman coffeehouse life. This time, we're exploring the controversies, the moral panics, the unhinged bans, and the wildly exaggerated fears that coffeehouses somehow posed an existential threat to society. Because nothing says powerful empire like being terrified of small cups of coffee. And so began a series of moral panics so dramatic they might as well have been written by an overexcited playwright. Let's dive into coffeehouse. Panic number 1. Coffee encourages laziness. Officials complained that people were spending too much time in coffeehouses. Hours, sometimes entire afternoons. Shocking, the empire needed workers, and here these men were, just sitting, talking, sipping. Clearly, this was the end of civilization. One legal scholar even argued that coffeehouses were sinful because they encouraged idleness and unproductive chatter. The wonderful irony is that he wrote this while sitting in a coffeehouse himself. Then we have coffeehouse panic number 2. People are talking too much about politics. This one is actually true. People did talk about politics, but they did it softly, politely, usually through metaphors about trees or the weather to avoid getting into trouble. But back in the 1500s, even a mild political conversation felt like rebellion. Add coffee, an energizing, brain-activating drink, and suddenly the government imagined everyone was plotting revolution between sips. In reality, most discussions probably went something like this. Do you think taxes will rise? Probably. Sip. Dangerous stuff, indeed. Moving on to coffeehouse panic number 3. Satan lives in the coffee pot. Yes, this was a real argument. Some extremely strict scholars claimed coffee was a dark, sinful substance, introducing new temptations. They said the coffee pot itself was like a demonic cauldron. They insisted it encouraged indulgence, which, to be fair, it did. But only the kind of indulgence where you sit in a chair and zone out for hours. Not exactly the work of the devil, but the rumor spread. People whispered that coffee made you wakeful at night, which was apparently proof of spiritual corruption. Meanwhile, everyone else was just shrugging, like, yeah, of course, it keeps you awake. That's literally the point. Coffeehouse panic. Number 4. Wives hate coffeehouses. And honestly, they kind of did. And you can't really blame them. Their husbands were spending too much time there, too much money there, and returning home very late with elaborate explanations about all the important news they'd heard. Some wives even compared coffeehouses to black holes for husbands, which is a pretty accurate description. Certain moralists actually wrote pamphlets declaring coffeehouses to be enemy zones for domestic harmony. That's just a very poetic way of saying, please stop staying out until midnight debating the price of wheat. Then there's coffeehouse panic. Number 5. There's secret gambling dens. Okay, there's a mild truth to this one. Some coffeehouses had hidden gambling rooms. Not dramatic high-stakes ones, just small, dim spaces where men bet on backgammon or wrestling matches. The typical gambling scandal often involved someone losing a dramatic amount of money, like a goat or a pair of shoes, or, in extreme cases, their entire dignity for the afternoon. But overall, it was pretty harmless. Yet the government acted like coffeehouses were the Las Vegas of Istanbul. Let us not forget coffeehouse panic. Number 6. Songs and stories are corrupting the youth. Yes, even the beloved meta storyteller was accused of moral corruption. Why? Because he sometimes made jokes about officials, or he exaggerated stories to entertain people, or he portrayed a foolish husband being tricked by a clever wife. Apparently, this was deeply threatening to the social order. Some preachers declared, "Let the young man go, not to the coffeehouse, lest he learn false stories and idle thoughts," which is just a fancy way of saying, stop laughing at satire and go study something. Finally, we have coffeehouse panic. Number 7. Janissaries are plotting there. This one was not actually wrong. The Janissaries, the elite soldiers of the empire, loved coffeehouses because they needed places to gather in large groups. And a bunch of soldiers in a small room is basically a recipe for complaining. Complaining leads to loud complaining. Loud complaining leads to irritation. Irritation can sometimes lead to rebellion. This is a very simplified political theory, but it worked suspiciously often. Whenever a rebellion happened, Someone always said, "So, you know." They were talking about this at the coffee house. Now, because of all these fears, the Ottoman sultans tried banning coffee houses multiple times. Let's gently glide through the most dramatic of these bans. The first one was back in the early 1500s. The argument was new substance, suspicious. Coffee was new. People were unsure. Some conservative clerics declared it unlawful, simply because drinking something dark and stimulating felt unnatural. This ban lasted for about 5 minutes. No one listened, and it just melted away like sugar in warm coffee. Then came the ban in the 1560s. Too many people gathering. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent got mildly annoyed by the growing crowds. He didn't fully ban coffee houses, but he started regulating them heavily. Because nothing says magnificent empire like micromanaging how men drink their beverages. Then, in the 1580s, we get the big one. Under Sultan Murad III, a strict scholar told him that coffee brace yourself had the same legal status as wine. Since wine was forbidden, coffee should be too. Murad said, "Sure, why not?" and banned coffee and coffee houses. People obeyed for about 15 minutes. Then they quietly reopened everything. Murad eventually just gave up. But the most famous ban of all came in 1633 under Sultan Murad IV. This sultan was not messing around. He banned smoking. He banned coffee. He banned gathering at night. He banned basically anything that looked like relaxation. This man woke up every morning and chose chaos. He was convinced that coffee houses were dens of rebellion, idleness, conspiracy, and backgammon crimes. So he would march through the streets disguised as a commoner. Yes, really checking if people were drinking coffee. Imagine sipping your drink, looking up, and seeing the literal Sultan of the Ottoman Empire staring at you like no caffeine for you. This ban lasted longer than the others, but it eventually faded away after Murad IV's death, because the empire really missed its coffee. After that, from the 1680s onward, the approach shifted. The new motto was, "We'll allow it, but we're watching you." Coffee houses were technically legal, but heavily monitored. Officials visited them regularly. Tax inspectors stopped by. Spies eavesdropped on conversations. And the coffee drinkers just pretended not to notice, nodding politely, while definitely, absolutely noticing. By the 1700s, coffeehouses had become so ingrained in Ottoman life that banning them was impossible. It was like trying to ban breathing, or naps, or complaining about the weather. Now, let's drift into the really funny accusations that were leveled at coffeehouses because the Ottoman moralists got creative. Among their claims were, coffee makes men disobedient. Coffee encourages sarcasm, which, honestly, is probably valid. Coffee causes insomnia that leads to immoral nightlife. Coffee houses are where men go to avoid their families. Also, probably valid. They also claimed coffee fostered dreams of rebellion, made people talk too much, and spread gossip faster than disease. Honestly, most of this is probably true, but none of it is dangerous, unless you count a gossip-induced identity crisis. Still, despite all the panic, all the bans, and all the accusations, coffee houses survived. Why? Because they were comforting. They were safe, warm, and inviting. They were more predictable than the world outside, a small oasis of routine in a chaotic world. And because humans, throughout all of history, have looked at rules, shrugged, and said, I'm still going to do what I want. Thanks so much for floating along with me today. If you enjoyed this journey, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next trip through history. See you next time. Hey everyone, and welcome back. If you're still awake at this hour, I'm impressed. If you're drifting off, even better. Tonight, we're just going to float through an Ottoman coffee house, like a half-conscious ghost that smells faintly of cardamom. Let's just slide in quietly. We've talked about the rooms, the drinks, the politics, the storytelling, the whole vibe. But now, we're wandering into one of my favorite parts of Ottoman coffeehouse culture, the regulars. Because every single coffeehouse, from a tiny wooden shack hovering over a muddy street in Bursa, to a grand marble-floored shop next to a palace in Istanbul, had its own cast of characters. People who showed up so reliably, the owner might as well have charged them rent. Let us begin with the most iconic species in the Ottoman caffeine ecosystem, the wise old uncle who eyes in tea, actually wise, but definitely sounds like it. Every coffee house had one. This man was usually around 60, but life had weathered him so much he looked 80. He'd rub his beard like he was scrubbing a brass lamp, searching for wisdom. And whenever he started a story with "back in my day," everyone would mentally prepare for a 40-minute journey that would go absolutely nowhere. But he sounded so philosophical that younger men would nod politely. Even when he was talking about, say, the migration habits of pigeons, or why his neighbor's goats were being disrespectful. But he had seniority, and in Ottoman social life, that alone was enough to make him the wise one. Next, let us meet the guy who hasn't bought his own coffee since the previous Sultan's reign. You know this one. He arrives with so much enthusiasm, slapping shoulders, greeting everyone like a long-lost brother returning from exile. But for some mysterious reason, he never actually orders anything. He'll lean in, laugh, say something charming, and suddenly, almost magically, the waiter brings him a cup, saying it's from this gentleman over here. He has perfected the art of social caffeine parasitism. Nobody hates him, but nobody really loves him either. Everyone just kind of accepts that, yes, this man will contribute nothing but vibes. And honestly, that's a respectable lifestyle. Now, let's turn to the aspiring poet who is definitely not going to make it. Ottoman coffeehouses were basically the open mic poetry nights of the 17th century, and into this scene steps our poet. He always has a notebook. He's always sighing dramatically. He always claims that inspiration strikes him at the most inconvenient times. He'll recite his verses to the entire room, usually without being asked, and the poems, let's just say they're ambitious. Something like, "My heart is a burning ship, drifting on the sea of destiny, and love is the anchor, which I cannot pull up. Even though I tried many times." Seriously, many times. He waits for applause, and sometimes he gets it, but only because the audience is too polite to object. Still, poets like him helped make coffeehouses into cultural engines. Half the literary trends of the empire were born between those smoky walls. Just, maybe not from this particular poet. Then there's the man who knows every single government rumor within 48 hours. He sits in the corner, quiet. His eyes are sharp, but his ears are even sharper. You'd think he works for the Sultan's intelligence network. But no, he's just the kind of guy who somehow knows every bureaucratic whisper from Damascus to adorn? Did the Grand Vizier sneeze in public? He knows. Did a provincial governor lose an argument with his own accountant? He knows. Did a janissary shout at a pigeon? He knows. And he can tell you the pigeon's color. He lives for information. He trades it like currency. And if you give him a free cup of coffee, he'll unload a week's worth of gossip that somehow feels more valuable than gold. People didn't just come to coffee houses for caffeine. They came for this guy. Of course, the coffee houses weren't just for talking. They were for games, especially backgammon, or, as Ottoman folks called it, tavla. And that brings us to the backgammon champion, who takes it way, way too seriously. There was always one man who played like he was defending the honor of the entire empire. He slams the dice. He moves the pieces with surgical precision. He leans in so close his opponent can count every hair in his mustache. And when he wins, which he usually does, he doesn't celebrate loudly. Oh no. He simply raises one eyebrow with the quiet confidence of a man who believes he has just personally defeated the enemies of the state. And if he loses, impossible, he doesn't lose. He merely allows others to win occasionally for morale. Sure, buddy. Let's not forget the student who's obviously avoiding studying. This one is timeless. Young, tired, clearly under pressure from his parents, his teachers, and probably his entire lineage of ancestors staring down at him with disappointment. Endless memorization, endless commentary, endless expectations. So the coffee house became a refuge, cozy, caffeinated escape from responsibility. Honestly, I can relate. Then you have the merchant, who always looks like he's about to sell you something. He has a big smile, a booming voice, and a pouch full of samples from his cousin's workshop. He never stops talking. He never stops promoting. He never takes a day off. If the conversation lulls for even a second, he's already telling you about a great deal on rugs, spices, or boat parts. You don't even need a boat. He'll convince you that you should have one. Merchants loved coffee houses because they were the perfect hunting ground for social connections. Deals were made, friendships were formed, and occasionally someone walked in wanting a quiet evening and walked out with a camel saddle. It happens. In the corner, you'll always find the silent, mysterious one who just sips and watches. Every coffeehouse had him. He barely speaks. He sits alone. He drinks slowly. And everyone is convinced he's either a philosopher or hiding from someone. In reality, he's probably just tired, but his silence adds to the charm. His presence gives the room that soft background tension that makes the gossip juicier and the storytelling more dramatic. He's the Ottoman equivalent of the guy in a modern cafe with headphones on, staring at nothing, quietly contemplating life. A total mood. And over there, you see the group of old friends who laugh at jokes from 40 years ago. These guys take up an entire table. They talk loudly. They repeat the same stories every single day. One of them always misremembers the events. Another corrects him, even though he's wrong too. A third just sips his coffee like he's been trapped in this loop since the previous century. And the laughter. The kind of laughter that fills the room and warms the air. Coffeehouses were community centers, places where friendships stretched out for decades, where memories piled up like discarded coffee cups. Even if you didn't know the group, you felt the comfort of their presence. It was like emotional wallpaper. And let us not forget the man who thinks he is the Sultan's secret advisor. He's not, but he definitely thinks he is. He talks about politics like he personally runs the empire. He analyzes military campaigns like a commander. He speaks of court dynamics like he has afternoon tea with the valid sultan. Nobody tells him he's wrong because he's entertaining, and because occasionally you get something right. Everyone has to have a hobby, right? And finally, at the center of it all, the owner. He's the quiet center of the storm. He keeps the fire going. He watches the regulars with an air of affectionate resignation. He refills cups before people even have to ask. He knows when to intervene, when to stay out of the way, and when someone just needs their 80th cup of coffee for emotional support. He's part father figure, part referee, part economist, part therapist. Running a coffee house was a delicate art, maintaining the atmosphere, managing supplies, keeping the room from exploding into arguments about poetry or politics. But most owners had this peaceful calmness about them, a gentle authority. They knew that life was always swirling inside these wooden walls, and they were the quiet heart keeping it all beating. And so, in the dim glow of the oil lamps, surrounded by smoke and murmured conversations, these personalities all mixed together, creating an Ottoman social microcosm that felt alive, familiar, and strangely comforting. Let's drift onward. because there's still so much more to explore in these nighttime corners of the empire. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.